Well, hello again. My name's Adrian Gilbert, and we're going to continue our investigation into the Apocalypse, the last book in the Bible, also known as the Book of Revelation. And this is going to be a very short piece from the book, but actually quite a considerable lecture, so we're going to need to crack on. We've done chapters 1, 2, and 3, or at least as much as we really want to at this point. But chapter 4, we're starting to get into the main story, as it were, of what's going to be discussed. And it begins with a sentence that contains the words, "Lo, in heaven a gate is open." And that's what we're going to consider today. Because although that's a very short little sentence, and you might think, well, doesn't really mean very much, does it? It's just kind of a little intro to what's going to follow. Actually, it does. It has a lot of implications and connections with the past and with other teachings, not just from Christianity, but also from what went with the Greco-Roman tradition and also the Egyptian tradition. And if we wanted to go there, we could connect it with the ancient British and the ancient Mexican as well. This is a very big subject, this whole conception of this gate in heaven. Anyway, so let's press on. And here you can see a picture. I showed it to you in the previous lecture, which was painted for me by my old friend Bengt Alfredsson, a Swedish artist who very sadly passed away a couple of years ago now. I asked him to paint this for one of my books, which is called Signs in the Sky, and it kind of summed up a lot of what I was wanting to say about the start of the Book of Revelation, and indeed this open gate, because there you can see the gate, and it's open, and there's this Christ-like figure who calls himself the first and the last, standing amid 7 candlesticks, and he's holding stars in his hand, and he's talking to St. John, who's the figure sitting on the ground there, ready to copy everything into his manuscript or his book. So that's where we got up to, but now we're going to consider what this actual book is. So without more ado, I want to take you back a bit further into the Bible. We're going to look at the Gospel of Matthew, which Matthew was one of the apostles, and he was therefore able to see a lot of what was going on in the whole Jesus adventure, you could call it. But he was also worked closely with Peter, and so we have his gospel, which is sometimes called the Gospel of the Kingdom. But again, we're not going to go into that now. But I just wanted to take this little quote from the gospel itself, and I'm going to read it out to you. It goes, "You are Peter, and upon this rock," which is Petros in Greek, "I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." I should just say here for a moment that this is the actual literal translation from the Greek. I think in the King James Version it says the powers of evil will not prevail against it. But that's not what it says actually in the Greek. It actually does say gates of Hades. And you should understand that Hades was the Greek and Roman concept of the underworld, not necessarily hell as such, but an underworld where souls went to after death. So we have this idea that the gate is the gate of Hades, which is the other world that you go to after death. And not prevailing against it. Well, how does a gate prevail against you? It prevails against you if you can't open it. If the gate is shut to you, then that is the gate is overcoming you. It's prevailing. So if you've got the keys, like St. Peter's going to have here, then the gate won't prevail against you because you can open it with your key. And he goes on here and he says, I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. So there you have it, this conception of this gateway, that Peter's got the key, so it's not going to prevail against him, but he's been told that whatever he binds on earth, in other words, if he excommunicates someone, then they're not going to get into heaven. They've got to go, he's the gatekeeper, they've got to go through him to get to that gateway, to have it open for them. And that's why we have all those jokes, about St. Peter meeting you at the gates and asking you questions. There's a lot of jokes on that sort of basis. Anyway, so we see here, this is how Peter's usually depicted, holding the keys of the gates, and he's dressed as a pope. He's got the pallium round his neck, which is that sort of circular thing round his neck with a dangly bit in the front. There's another bit at the back with a cross on it that shows that he's, the senior bishop, and he's Bishop of Rome. So where does this idea come from? So I was saying to you earlier that it's not necessarily just a Christian thinkness. It goes back into paganism of various sorts. And that seems to be what we're being told here. Now, the Catholic Church has very particular ideas about this. And it says, after Peter died in 60 AD, it's about then he died, his successor as Bishop of Rome was St. Linus. And you can find the lineage of all the different bishops of Rome if you look it up. You'll find it on the internet. And according to the Catholic Church, Linus inherited the keys of St. Peter, and these have since been symbolically passed on to each pope in succession. And that's why we see in the papal coat of arms the cross keys representing the keys to the gates of heaven. And there they are. They're shown on the arms of the Vatican and Holy See. And that happens to this day. Now, that's all very well, and I have to tell you that although Catholics are adamant that that's the truth, and therefore the Pope is the most senior cleric in the world, and he's the final authority in the Church, and that he's therefore got the keys. He's been chosen not just by the cardinals who choose the next Pope, but they're supposedly guided by the Holy Spirit to to give the vote to the right man. Well, you have to wonder, don't you, sometimes? But other churches within Christendom don't go along with that at all. Grudgingly, some of the Orthodox churches do, but that was because of the Muslim invasions in the 11th century, that they needed help from the West. They needed crusades to come and help them. So before that, they were adamant that the Pope was no better than one of them. In fact, the church in Rome wasn't founded before their own churches. The church in Jerusalem, church in Damascus, in Ephesus, Antioch, these places, they were all founded long before the church in Rome was founded. So they would claim seniority on that basis. Anyway, but that doesn't concern us. As investigators, we have to ask ourselves this. Is the story of Jesus, Peter, and simply a metaphor that either Jesus or the gospel writers invented? Or is the idea that heaven has gates an older concept that was simply borrowed in the Peter story? And you probably won't be surprised to hear that that's what I think. And I don't believe that Jesus was just this carpenter's son who suddenly had an inspiration and started a church. We don't know what happened to him between the ages of 12 and 30. So that's 18 years of his life. That's a long time. And I'm convinced that he was out of the country, out of Judea. Almost certainly he would have gone to Egypt, because the family had connections there from when he was a small baby. So he would even have people that he could go and look up. And there were important schools of philosophy there, particularly Philo Judaicus, a Jewish teacher in Alexandria who wrote many books of philosophy. But I think he very likely also went east, certainly to Persia, probably to India, meeting wise men. And you might think, well, he didn't need to do that, Adrian, because he's already knows everything. He's God. Yes, but even the holiest among us have to wake up and be helped. And this is certainly the pathway that was followed by other great teachers, people like Pythagoras, who went to Egypt looking for wisdom, and then he went to Babylon. He was taken there, actually, by Cambyses when he invaded Egypt. And so he learnt the teachings of wise men from other places. Moses was instructed in the teachings of the Egyptians. We're actually told that in the Bible. So these teachers were not necessarily operating just within their own confines. They wanted to know what other people knew as well. And I think that Jesus was certainly initiated, if that's the right term to use, into the teachings of the East. We can get that from the way he taught in parables, which was not how they did things in the Jewish religion, but was very much how they did things with Buddhism, say, in the East. So I think he probably did travel a lot, and he would have been exposed to other traditions. So it's not so surprising if he had heard other teachings to do with gates in heaven. But you might dismiss that and say, well, you're talking nonsense, Adrian. But anyway, I think we have to ask ourselves, is the idea that heaven has gates an older concept that was simply borrowed in the Peter story? So now I'm going to present you with some evidence. And the first bit of evidence I want to give you is from someone called Macrobius, who was a Roman writer, writing in approximately AD 400. And he was a Neoplatonist author, and he wrote a number of books. Several of these actually have been found, or at least fragments of them have been found. I think he was quite a prolific writer in his day, and he would have been what's called a Neoplatonist. And they were people operating in sort of Christian era, kind of rediscovering the teachings and the work of Plato and the Platonic school, which was a famous school in Athens, founded by Plato in the 4th century BC. The Neoplatonists wanted to revive that, and they were doing that within the pagan tradition of Rome. But by 400 AD, when Macrobius was writing, the Roman Empire was already Christian. It's been Christianized in 325 by Constantine the Great. So although Macrobius himself was probably still a pagan, he would have known about the Christians, but more importantly, he would have known about the pagan writings of the school of the Platonists. And when I say pagan, I'm not talking about people who put woad on their faces and dance naked around bonfires. We're talking about very intelligent people in the Greek and Roman Empire who were studying the stars, studying mathematics, following teachings like the Pythagorean school, or what was left of it, learning from the Orphics, learning from all the traditions of the ancient world. These were superseded by the Christian church, but it did bring in a lot of what this ancient wisdom was into its own, fledgling faith. And this, I think, this idea about the gates of heaven would have been part of that. Now, one of the fragments that we have is a book. I think it was only a chapter or a few chapters of a larger work written by Macrobius, and it was a commentary on the dream of Scipio. And the book itself was a work of fiction, but it was written by Cicero, a famous Roman politician, a lawyer, author, poet, and writer, and he lived between 106 and 43 BC. Now, you've maybe heard of Cicero. I mean, he features in Shakespeare's play Julius Caesar, which I had a small role in when I was at school. You know, we put on Julius Caesar. But he was alive at the time of Caesar, and he was a great orator, a lawyer who would defend people in court. They had courts in Rome. It wasn't all just this barbaric, throw them to the lions sort of place. It was actually a very legalistic republic at that time. It wasn't the Roman Empire at the time of Cicero. It was a republic, and he was one of the leading figures from one of the major families of Rome. And I think I'm right in saying that the Scipios were kind of ancestors of Cicero himself. I may be wrong on that, but I think that's the case. Anyway, in the dream, this is the dream that Cicero writes, and Macrobius then comments on. Macrobius writes a whole book on this. The actual dream portion itself is quite short within the book. And in the dream, Scipio Aemilianus, who lived 185 to 124 BC, who was the general who led the Roman army in the destruction of Carthage in 146 BC. Just a few words there. Carthage was a major city in North Africa, in what's now Tunis, or Tunisia, and it was the great rival of Rome, the Roman Empire. And Carthage at that time controlled North Africa and Spain for some time, and Gibraltar and that western Mediterranean area, Sardinia, and the other islands in the western Mediterranean, and the trade routes that would go there from the east. And so there was a major rival to Rome as the Roman Empire was starting to get larger within Italy. And then the Romans and the Carthaginians came to blows, and they fought three wars. They're called the Punic Wars. And in the third Punic War, the last one, this guy, Scipio Aemilianus, was the general, and he took an army across to North Africa. Hannibal had been ravaging Italy, although he had been defeated there. And he came back to Africa to defend Carthage. And they fought a big battle, and Hannibal lost. So this Scipio Aemilianus was a great hero in Rome for defeating Hannibal, and then he went on to destroy the city of Carthage. They utterly destroyed it, the Romans. I mean, it's later rebuilt, but they utterly destroyed it to make sure its power would never rise again. Anyway, in the dream, he meets his step-grandfather. I think that's the right term, yeah. He was a grandfather by adoption. I mean, so make of that what you will. But anyway, his step-grandfather was Scipio Africanus, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, who was a great hero from the Second Punic War. And this elder Scipio takes in the dream, he shows the younger Scipio, gives him a lesson about the heavens and how they're constructed and where souls go to. And in the dream, he describes to the younger how heaven is constructed of concentric spheres. And the outermost sphere of the fixed stars, he says, is the abode of God. In particular, he talks about the Milky Way and how human souls, which are eternal, dwell there after death, if they're good enough, that is. Macrobius's commentary investigates these ideas and tells us more about the gates of heaven and their connection with the Milky Way. Now, I'm not going to take you through the whole book. It's quite a big one. I have actually got a copy. But what I'm going to do is give you some quotes. So here is a quote from the commentary of Scipio, of the Dream of Scipio, and this is written, as I said, around about 400 AD. The Milky Way girdles the Zodiac, its great circle meeting it obliquely, so that it crosses it at the two tropical signs, Capricorn and Cancer. Natural philosophers named these the portals of the sun, because the solstices lie athwart the sun's path on either side. Souls are believed to pass through these portals when going from the sky to the earth, returning from the earth to the sky. For this reason, one is called the portal of men, and the other the portal of gods. Now, I know that's a little bit confusing, but I have actually got a globe here. If I can just get it for a moment, and I'll see if I can demonstrate that to you. I hope you can see that. This is actually a celestial sphere. It's not a globe as you would normally know a globe of the Earth. This is a globe of the sky. And the dots you can see upon it, I hope you can see them. I wonder if I can plug it in. That might make it a little bit easier to see. That might make it a little easier to see. Perhaps if I turn some of these other lights off, it might be even easier. Just 1 second. See it a bit better now. Now the globe itself, can you see around here? There's this is the equator that I'm moving my hand around now. This is the equator of the globe, and it's a projection of our own Earth's equator. And you can think of the pole, the North Pole coming out here, as being the continuation of our North Pole from the Earth going up into the sky. So that's why the globe sits just as the Earth does, at an angle of 23.5 degrees. Now, you can also maybe make out here a band, a sort of brighter band going round the globe. It actually goes all the way around it. And that is the Milky Way. And when you look at the sky, if you have a clear sky, it's not so easy when you're living in southern England, as I do, to see the Milky Way because there's so much light pollution. But if you're ever in a place where there isn't that light pollution, you'll see this great band of stars. It's like a splash of milk down the sky. There's so many of them, a sort of white band, and that's the Milky Way. And it sort of rises and forms an archway and then kind of tips back, and then an archway comes up the other side because the whole thing is, the Earth's turning, so it's what we're seeing of the sky is also turning, if you can understand that. The sky doesn't actually go round us. It's because our Earth is spinning that we perceive it as going round. Now I want you to see another round here. Can you see these yellow dots here? They form a pathway, which is the pathway that the sun follows as it's going through the Zodiac, going through all the signs of the Zodiac, and that's those yellow dots that you can see. And the sun is moving along that pathway at roughly 1 degree every day. So you know it takes 365 days for a year, and there's 360 degrees, so it's nearly the same. And the sun crosses over, I don't know if you can see it there, it crosses over the equator, and it does that as in its movement. It's coming out here. It does that at the equinox, at the spring equinox. It moves into the northern hemisphere and it comes up to a peak. And you can see the peak there when it's its furthest point north. And it does that at the solstice, which is for us the 21st of June in the northern hemisphere. And then it proceeds to go back down and it crosses again here at the autumn equinox, which is in September, around about 21st September. Then it goes on down here and it comes down, and at the winter solstice just before Christmas, on the 21st of December, it's at its lowest point, and it's right down here. Now what I wanted to show you here, and we'll see other pictures that will make this clearer for you in a minute. At the summer solstice, it's actually at its most northerly point, and these days it's in between the signs of Gemini and Taurus. But because the way that we look at it from astrology, I know this is going to be a little bit complicated, but I'm going to try and make it simple. We have, when we're talking about astrology in particular, we have this idea that the first day of spring is when the sun goes into Aries. So if you're born on the first, within the first 30 days from the spring, you would say that you're an Aries, yeah? And I'm sure you've got Aries friends. I have. And then the next sign is Taurus. So if you're born in, it's roughly from about the 22nd of April, to the 22nd, something like that, of May, you'll be a Taurus. And then the next sign after that is Gemini, and then Cancer, then Leo, and so you go round. And that zodiac that your birth sign so-called is actually not the same as the stars where the sun is on that time. And the reason for that is simple. It's because the Earth has another movement which is called precession, and it means that the first day of spring slides back through the zodiac by 1 degree every 72 years. So when they were compiling the zodiac in Greek times, yes, it was Aries was the first sign of spring, but it slipped back, and it's been in Pisces for the last 2,000 years. So I know it's a little bit complicated, but we don't need to care about that, because what we're looking at in what I'm going to be talking about is actually where the stars are these days. And okay, moved on here, I need to go back. Yeah. So we got our quote from Macrobius here, that the Milky Way girdles the Zodiac. Well, I've shown you that, how the Milky Way goes round the whole sphere, and it crosses over the Zodiac in two places. And it crosses at two tropical signs. It calls them Capricorn and Cancer, but actually that is not correct. And it's again because of this precession. The real signs that it crosses over were actually Gemini and Sagittarius. Now, another very interesting book is this one here. It's called Hamlet's Mill. It's written much more recently, 1969. A very interesting book. If you haven't got it, I highly recommend it. Although it is out of print at the moment, but you might be able to get a second-hand copy. It's quite a complicated book, but to put it in a nutshell, it's really an investigation into the world's mythologies and I don't just mean European mythologies, but all over the world, looking at how the tales that people tell as their ancient mythology, and Hamlet's Mill goes back to actually a Finnish poem, I think, which went to Iceland. Kalevala, it's in the Kalevala about this mill that supposedly ground gold, and then later on it ground salt, and then it thrown in the sea and it ground sand, and the sand, that's how we have the sand in the sea. But they go into what that's really all about, which is to do with astronomy and the precession of the equinox, and how that actually has affected the world's mythology to do with all sorts of different stories like Hercules, etc., from the Greek myths. Anyway, they did have another look at this dream of Scipio, the commentary by Macrobius, and they had some very interesting things to say about it, which I'm going to discuss with you now. So here's a quote from them. Macrobius talks of signs, the constellations rising at the solstices in his time, and still in ours, were Gemini and Sagittarius. The gate of Cancer means Gemini. In fact, he states explicitly 1:12:5 that the gate is where the Zodiac and Milky Way intersect. Now, I was showing you the sky globe just now, how the Milky Way is, see it there, this band of white on the globe here intersects with this pathway of these dots representing the sun, which is the ecliptic, the journey of the sun, and it crosses over the Milky Way at a specific point, and that point is actually now at the summer solstice, which is interesting because it didn't used to be. And the way that the Earth is set up and its various cycles and movements, we have this 26,000 year precessional cycle caused by this sort of wobbling motion of the Earth, and that causes, as I said, the first day of spring to move back 1 degree roughly every 72 years. But if the first day of spring moves back, so does every other day in the year. So the summer solstice moves back too. So the summer solstice, just as the spring equinox has moved back through a whole sign, it's moving through Pisces, actually moving into Aquarius now. So the summer solstice has moved back, and it's moved actually right through Gemini now, and it's now right at the cusp between Gemini and Taurus. And that, extraordinarily, is where this gateway of the sun is, as we'll see shortly. So, if I put this on here, you can see here we have the Milky Way, and we can see how the ecliptic is crossing it over. And I've got two pictures of the globe that showing the northern hemisphere and the southern hemisphere. And you can see how the northern hemisphere, which is on the left, crosses over the Milky Way above the upstretched hand of Orion. You can imagine that Orion sometimes is shown holding a club, but it's also, you could say it's his hand stretched up. The ecliptic is over that hand, and that is where the ecliptic crosses over the Milky Way. The median plane of the Milky Way is like its equator. You can think that the Milky Way is a disk of stars, and we're looking at it edgeways on. We look at other spiral galaxies, we sometimes look at them head on, so we're actually standing at what would be their north or south pole, I suppose, looking down at them or looking up at them. But we're looking at our own galaxy, which is a sort of flattened, sort of pancake-like thing, like a discus. And it has a north side and a south side, you could say, or an upper and lower side. And there's a a region in between. Perhaps they're magnetized differently, north to south. That's something for someone to investigate, perhaps. But there's this median plane, which is like the equator of the Milky Way, and the point where the ecliptic crosses it now is exactly at the summer solstice. Now you might say, well, that's just coincidence, doesn't matter. But it does matter in terms of time cycles. And very likely it does matter in other ways too. But this seems to be the time when the gates are or can be opened. The other gateway, you see on the right-hand side, is above the sting of Scorpio in Sagittarius. And that one is facing more or less towards the center of the galaxy. The other one, the one over Orion, is actually facing out of the galaxy. So that could be an important difference as well. You can see that here. The right-hand side, the southern gateway above the sting of Scorpio in Sagittarius in the Milky Way, and that's looking towards roughly the center of the galaxy. But what about before the Roman age? I mean, these Macrobius and Cicero was pre-Christian, but he's still in the Roman age. What was going on before then? Santillana and von Deschend are talking about ancient times. So what's evidence about ancient times and talking about gates? Well, there is a mention of the gates in the most famous text of ancient Egypt, the Book of the Dead. Of course, the ancient Egyptians didn't call it the Book of the Dead. That name was given to it because at the time Wallis Budge translated the papyrus of Ani, which is only one papyrus, but it's a very well preserved and long one. He decided to call his translation the Egyptian Book of the Dead after there had been the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which had been a modest bestseller. So he called his one the Ancient Egyptian Book of the Dead to help sales, I guess. I think the real title is The Coming Forth by Day. But anyway, we can see here is an extract from the Papyrus of Ani, and it says here, I opened the door in heaven. So we have this concept that the ancient Egyptians were talking about. This is part of their Osiris process, that they're wanting to go to heaven. And they have all sorts of spells and chants and hymns and incantations and prayers to help the pharaoh's soul go to heaven. So he has to go through the door. I opened the door in heaven. And you see the symbol there for door is a bird with a star next to it and written underneath Sabah. Sabah is the Egyptian word for star. And that bird is the ah sound, so sbah. So that's actually saying star, right? But he's calling it a door because next to it you've got that other hieroglyph of a chamber with an entrance. So it's really the gateway of that. The gateway is the entrance, and so the real name ought to, I think, be Stargate, Spa Gateway. Anyway. I'm a great fan of the movie and the TV series about Stargate. But maybe the Egyptians, they certainly had this idea that there was this gateway in the sky, the Stargate, and the pharaoh had to go through it. And why did he want to go through? He tells us in the next bit, I rule upon the throne. Now, you have to ask yourself, well, what throne is he going to rule upon? Well, again, we're going to see more about this throne and what that means to the ancient Egyptians as we go a bit further on with this. And we find talk of both gates and the throne of heaven in the pyramid texts. These were inscribed in some of the Old Kingdom pyramids dating from the 5th and 6th dynasties. The inscriptions are therefore 1,000 years older than the New Kingdom Book of the Dead. Indeed, the religious ideas they discuss are very likely much older than that, going back to pre-dynastic times. And why do I say that? Well, the Osiris religion seems to predate the Old Kingdom, and a lot of what's written in the pyramid texts, they don't give you their Bible as such. They give you the offshoots from it. It's like a prayer book. If you imagine if you went into a church and you picked up a prayer book, you get some idea about what the Christian religion's about. And you look up and you would see stained glass windows and pictures and crucifixes and things. You think, well, what on earth is this all about? And if you hadn't got a copy of the New Testament with the Gospels, you would be perplexed. And that's rather how we are with the pyramid texts and the other texts that we see inscribed in the pyramids, but also in coffins and in these papyri, like the Book of the Dead is a translation of. But it rather implies that they already knew about this religion and that somewhere they must have had teachers, perhaps oral teachers, telling them about these things. Not to mention that there's probably an awful lot that we don't know that was lost. But we find in the pyramid texts, it also says, the doors of the firmament means the heavens, are thrown open to you. The you in this case is the Pharaoh. And you will find Re, that's the sun god, standing as he waits for you. He will take your hand for you and guide you to the two conclaves of the sky. He will set you on the throne of Osiris. So that's the throne that the king wants to go and sit on. He wants to go and sit on the throne of Osiris. Now you might think, well, what's he going to do? Is he going to displace Osiris? No, it's not like that. He wants to become one with Osiris. It's just as a Christian wants to become one with Christ. So in the Egyptian religion, they wanted to become one with Osiris on his throne, relinked, reconnected to God. That might sound very heretical if you're a Christian. You think, well, these are Christian ideas, and some people even said that it was the devil who invented this religion as plagiarism in advance, thousands of years before Christianity. But I don't think so. I think it's that there was an understanding which the ancient Egyptians had and which perhaps Moses learnt about when he was there, and which has come down to us by succession and been realized in full within the Christian tradition, and the teachings are actually hidden in the Bible as well, and we're going to explore at least some of those within the context of this book of Revelation. So there's that text. The doors of the firmament are thrown open to you, and you will find Re, the sun god, standing as he waits for you. He will take your hand for you and guide you to the two conclaves of the sky. He will set you on the throne of Osiris. So we have to ask ourselves, where is the Egyptian gate of heaven? And they tell us this on some of the New Kingdom sepulchral ceilings. Sepulchre is where you bury someone, or you intend to bury them anyway. So that very often in these ancient Egyptian tombs, and you can go and see them today in the Valley of the Kings and the Queens, they have some wonderful ceilings on there with paintings and quite complicated very often, fascinating. But anyway, some of them are more easy to understand than others. And this is one of them. This is the sepulchral ceiling of a guy called Senmut, who was the vizier to Queen Hatshepsut, who ruled over Egypt between 1478 to 1458 BC. And here you can see, if you look on the left-hand side here, you can see there's a little figure in his boat with 3 stars above him. He represents Orion, who the Egyptians called Sach. And next to him, you can see there's a female figure, goddess. She represents the star Sirius. And how do we know that? Well, above her there are some hieroglyphs. And the first one with the triangle and the star, the little bun under it, rather, it says Soped. and there's a star there. And the next one with a throne with a bun under it, and the little goddess figure under it, says As, which is Isis. So Soped is their name for Sirius, and Ast is their name for Isis. And next to it, you can see I've put a square, a red square, around a bunch of hieroglyphs over the Orion figure. And we're going to go and have a look at those now and translate them, because they tell us a lot more. Now, first of all, you can see here in the middle, we've got a symbol of the stars of Orion, those 6 stars. They don't depict it exactly as you would see it in the sky, but that's how they depicted them in the hieroglyphs, to show the stars of Orion. And they also depict the dust clouds, which is interesting because we know that from astronomy, we know that there are big nebulae and dust clouds in Orion. Some are by the belt, and then you've got below the belt you have the sword of Orion, and in there is the Great Nebula, which some people, if they got good eyesight, which I haven't, unfortunately, they can make out that nebula with the naked eye, and it is actually the nearest and most powerful nebula to us. Place of enormous activity, and from our modern studies of Orion, we can tell that new stars are being born there. So that's an interesting part of the sky. Well, if you look there on the left-hand side, you see some hieroglyphs I've highlighted, and that says the upper part of Orion. The lying down, there's a star with a staff lying down and a couple of flags sticking up from it. That's the shorthand version of the hieroglyph for Sach, which means Orion. And below it, we have the figure of, I'm not quite sure what it represents. There's a fountain or something with 3 channels coming out of it. That represents the family. And it's the family of Horus. Horus is the bird next to it. So it's the family of Horus. And then, again, in the upper register, we have Arat, which means gateway star. Arat, gateway star, up there. So the Stargate, as I was just saying to you, so that's in the upper part of Orion. And below it, we see here the Eye of Horus, which is the sun. So it's telling us that the sun, so I'll show you these hieroglyphs. Sorry, I've turned that off. I'll do that again. I did the upper part, Orion, there, and you can see there where it says the upper part of Orion, and below it there's the figure of the family of Horus with those 3 fountains coming out, and below it, and the bird, which is Horus. And then next to still in the upper part is Arat, which means the gateway, and below it a star, so gateway star. And next to that, the Eye of Horus, the sun. So the gateway star is the Stargate, which we've just been looking at in other hieroglyphs, and the sun is positioned there. So that is the sun holding the hand of the deceased pharaoh and bringing him to the Stargate, which is where the crossover point is between the ecliptic and the Milky Way. So that's telling us very clearly that these rituals were to take the pharaoh to the stars. He was going to go to the gateway, open the gate and go in, and there he is. He's now in the upper part of Orion, and he's going to journey through that constellation to get to the lower part. And we see over here, those hieroglyphs, they both sides say the lower part of Orion. And what do we find in the lower part of Orion? We find the eye over a throne with a god figure, and that represents Osiris, or Sa, that's how that's pronounced. And we see next to it, again, the family of Horus, but now as stars. Now, what does that mean? Well, in ancient Egypt, as you probably know, the they had the god Horus. Now, I've actually got a little statue of Horus, which I bought in Egypt. I rather liked him. And you can see that he's a little hawk-headed god. Now, this one is what's called Horus the Younger, and he's the son of Osiris and Isis, supposedly. And Osiris is murdered by his evil brother Set, and Isis gathers up, Set chops up his body and scatters the parts along the Nile. Isis goes up and gathers the body, the parts, binds them together with bandages to make the first mummy, gets magic words from the sun god to resurrect her husband. Somehow she manages to have sex with him. It must have been some kind of IVF, I guess. And she becomes pregnant, and she has Horus. Meanwhile, Osiris, the soul of Osiris, goes off to the stars to Orion. All well and good. Well, then Horus fights. When he gets old enough, he has a battle with his uncle. This again is very Hamlet. And he defeats the uncle, and he reestablishes the true line of the pharaohs from his father's line, Osiris, to bring civilization and the rule of law to Egypt, Mut. So the Egyptians are big on this. But there was another Horus who's known as Horus the Elder, and he's a sky god. And our word horizon comes from that. Horus the Elder is really the god, or the... I don't like using this word God, because when you're brought up in Christianity, we only believe in one God. And so when you start talking about gods, it doesn't ring right, does it? Probably be better to say the spirit or the angel or the archangel, whatever you want to call it, that rules over this solar system is Horus. So this solar system in Egyptian is called Horus. And the people of this solar system are the sons of Horus. So the family of Horus, the sons of Horus, are actually us, the human race. Now, I'm going to be saying more about this when we go further on in the Revelation. But you can see, therefore, that here, where in the right-hand side it talks about the family of Horus as stars, this is talking about the humans who've left the earth and gone to Orion and become stars there. This is what the ancient Egyptians believed and what they wanted. And curiously enough, it seems that the Orion constellation, not the Orion constellation, the Orion Nebula, where the sword is where stars are being born. And very curiously, and we haven't got time to go into this, but in Mexico, they have other legends about the constellation of Orion as being the place where humanity came from, and the gods came from, and they specifically point to the sword area where the nebula is as being like a fire in heaven, and that's where they came from. So I'll leave that with you. And we have other examples of Orion in Egypt. This is on the Ben stone, or the pyramidion of a pharaoh called Amenemhet III, who was a Middle Kingdom pharaoh. So we've looked at Old Kingdom, we've looked at New Kingdom, now we're looking at Middle Kingdom. And again, you can see Orion, the hieroglyph there, and then you've got the determinative, the little walking man with his staff, a Waj scepter, I think that one is, and he's cupping a star in his hand. Well, that star in his hand is the Stargate. So you can see there the long form, and there's the determinative of Orion. And there is the spa, or star, the hieroglyphic for a star. Now here you can see, this is taken from a screenshot from a program called Sky Globe, and you can see there the Northern Stargate. Now, as I said, there are two, and you can see from this slide here how it's actually between the constellations of Gemini and Taurus, and this is where the summer solstice takes place now, with the sun positioned right there over the hand of Orion. And here's another shot of the same thing, taken, this is the 21st of June 2000, and you can see here how it is positioned right over the hand or the upstretched arm of Orion. He's lying on his side here, and you can see the line there, solstice line, and that's where the sun is positioned on that day. And that's the prime vertical. And were you in Egypt on that day, as I was, you would have seen that the sun, as it crossed, the prime vertical runs from east to west, going through the zenith point. It goes through the zenith point, which is directly overhead. So when the sun is at that angle, the appropriate angle on that day, it actually appears to sit on top of the Khafra pyramid at Giza, which is the central one of the three. The three pyramids represent Orion's belt. And the center, it sits on top. If you're standing at the bottom of the pyramid, you look up, you can see the sun there, and the pyramid casts no shadow. So that was obviously a very significant thing to the Egyptians. They would have known all about that, and be one reason why they gave that pyramid that angle. So here we can see the Stargate open on the 29th of June 2000. And I showed you this slide before in the previous lecture, where we had the planets gathered around, the 7 lamps around Orion. Now you can see why I was taught. Oh, let's show you that. Sorry. Go back. Do that one. Yeah, we did that one. You can see the planets gathered around Orion, and I've placed a little gateway there, the Stargate. That's where it would be positioned over Orion, and the gate is now open as of the year 2000 in summer solstice. And that's why I say that the revelation began really in the year 2000, and hasn't the world changed since then? I mean, within a month, I took a party of people and we actually watched Orion rising over the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. We saw the beginning. This was before the dawn, this is early in the morning. We saw the moon, Saturn and Jupiter rising before the sun and coming up over the Mount of Olives. Then, of course, once the sun got above or even just below the horizon, the sky goes bright and you can't see any stars, and you can't see the planets. But we know from Sky Globe that this is on the left-hand side here, where Mercury, Venus and Mars all close to the sun, on the other side of the Stargate. So that's our 7 lamps in the form of planets gathered around the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega. And you can see it there, the planets gathered around the Alpha and the Omega, the figure of Orion. So, why is it called the Alpha and the Omega? Well, it's quite simple, really, that because of the movement of the precession cycle, and I said to you that the Stargate, the Orion Stargate, is at its most northerly position now. That's why the sun is there at the summer solstice. But over the cycle, it moves from the most northerly position to the most southerly position, and then the southern Stargate is doing the reverse. So at the moment we have the northern Stargate in the northern hemisphere, the sun there at the summer solstice, and the sun at the southern Stargate, Sagittarius one, at around Christmas time, just before. But then if we go halfway round the precessional cycle, which takes roughly 26,000 years, so roughly 13,000 years later, they will reverse. So you would have the Sagittarius Stargate in the north, with the sun there at the summer solstice, and you would have the Orion Stargate in the south with the sun there at the winter solstice. Now, 13,000 years ago, that is how it would have been. And curiously enough, 13,000 years ago is the end of the last ice age. It's about 11,000 BC. So that was the start of our present half cycle of the age. So something happened then, and whether it was the destruction of Atlantis, previous civilization, or what, something happened. And then we've gone through a whole 13,000 period to the point where the Orion Stargate, and the Orion symbol of man in many respects, is now at its most northerly position. So I call the lower one the alpha position and the upper one the omega position. So they go alpha omega as they change places, the two stargates. So we are now at the position where the Stargate is open, which is what this picture is all about. And everything's changed in our world. Within a month of our, or a couple of months of our watching the stars over the Mount of Olives, the latest intifada broke out in Jerusalem, with people firing rifles and throwing stones from the Temple Mount at the police, and the police firing back, the army. And there's been no peace in the world since then. A year later, we had the Twin Towers brought down. We've had wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the whole Middle East is in crisis still. The West, we seem to be having all sorts of panics and changes and weird things happening. We've had extraordinary discovery of corruption within the church hierarchy in Rome. Shocking things being discovered and talked about and revealed about young seminarians and boys being abused by bishops and cardinals even. So we seem to be living through this apocalyptic time, and I can see that other things are going to happen, which we're going to discuss in future lectures. But it seems that it all started on the 29th of June, which is the feast of St. Peter and St. Paul. And that seems to be when that key went in that lock and opened that gate. And it doesn't seem to be just a one direction gate. It seems to have also enabled other things to happen on the earth that we perhaps wouldn't want to happen. Now, we've discussed this, the gate in heaven, from just that one little sentence within the beginning of chapter 4, and that chapter then goes on to talk about the throne of God. But before we go into all of that, and the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and the trumpets, and the bowls, and the seals, and all of that, I'm going to do a couple of other lectures which are going to be on the Logos Doctrine, because I think without some kind of knowledge about John's esoteric Christianity and how that ties in with with the book of Genesis, the very beginning of it, the creation, and then John's Gospel, the start of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the light, and the light was with God. You probably read it. We're going to go into that and what that's all about, and how that leads to the doctrine of the Trinity and what that is all about, because it's never explained to us. And one of the problems I have, and I'm sure you've had this too, is if I tell people that I believe in God, they say, what, do you believe in a sky fairy then? Do you believe in the tooth fairy as well, and Father Christmas? Ha ha! And it's the reason for that mockery is because people are taught a kind of very basic Christianity, the idea of the Father and looking after you, and when you die you go to heaven, as a small child. But they're not taught any kind of deeper philosophy, any deeper theology than that. So they're left with this, a kid's version of religion, and just told, well, just have faith and believe in it, it'll all be all right. Don't worry. Don't worry your little head about it. Just believe in it. It'll be okay. Well, I'm not like that. You know, I'm kind of scientific-y, and I'm very into philosophy. And philosophy, really, the real word philosophy doesn't mean discussing the chairness of a chair, you know, as Wittgenstein might do, or arguing how many angels sit on a pin. It's the love of wisdom. And you can have no wisdom if you don't have some sort of understanding of what life is for, why you're here, who you are, and what your potential is. If you don't discuss those questions, well, you may as well forget it. You know, you may as well go and sell chewing gum. So we're going to look at the Logos Doctrine, and I'm going to introduce you to a more senior school kind of religion, or Christian religion, Christian esotericism, as was understood by John, and he's the most mystical of the apostles, and he's the one who wrote the Revelation. So that's, I think it's kind of important that we understand a bit about where he's coming from and what that might mean for our understanding of his later book, the Revelation. Thank you very much for your time, and I'm sorry it's been such a long lecture, but we had to get through this one. It's an important one. Thank you again.